What about this disconnect between the Biden administration and economic reality? Let's talk about that with Roshini Rajkumar, longtime guest of the show who, well, rather than giving you the bio as it is today, August 30th, 2014 is the first time Roshini joined me on the show and says, I'm going down memory lane. Let's introduce her as I did the first time I interviewed her when we talked a little bit about how candidates were dressing, how Obama was dressing, like literally dressing, the clothes and the way that they conveyed in the subtextual messages, as well as other issues. I forgot that Rick Perry, for example, who was getting ready to run for president, supposedly, he ended up not doing so, I think, in 2016, but he had been indicted for something. And there's this whole, it was fascinating. But here's how we introduced Roshini. What image do these kinds of things send to the American people? And also, what about color choices, clothing, those kinds of things? Do they exhibit power? Do they exhibit authority? Do they exhibit submissiveness in some ways? What can people's different ways of communicating tell you about how they are expressing themselves and how do they come across? Very pleased to have on for what I'm sure will be a fascinating conversation, Roshini Rajkumar. She's a communication consultant who works with business and sports executives, including the Minnesota Vikings. Roshini is a licensed attorney and holds a BA from Boston College and is the author of Communicate That, Your Toolbox for Powerful Presence. She is one that companies call to coach executives so that they don't make mistakes in today's 24/7 news cycle or to fix a business blunder. If it's already happened, you can check her out at RoshiniGroup.com. That's ROSHINIGROUP, RoshiniGroup.com. And I think this is going to be an interesting conversation. Roshini, welcome to the Jimmy Sangenberger Show here on 710 KNUS. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. Thanks for having me on. And this is a great topic. Some really good things we can get into.
Well, gotta love when a guest, I was 21, by the way, at the time, when a guest comes on the program and years later, now she's got her podcast, The Crisis Files, on its 58th episode. Years later, she's still a regular, offering tremendous insights on so many topics. Roshini Rajkumar returns to the Jimmy Sangenberger Show. Good morning, Roshini.
Good morning, Jimmy, and congratulations. 10 years on the airwaves. That is a feat. And what I'm reminded of from you playing that, pulling from the vault, is you were only 21. That is just crazy to me, because I just think about over the years, all the conversations you and I have had, and you've been a young man in those conversations who's definitely come into his own. So I'm really, really honored that you've kept me coming back, and also just so excited for you and the people of your listening area that they've gotten to hear you for 10 years.
And you know what? I need to correct. I'm not good at math. I was 23. Still though. Yeah. But I was like, wait a second. I was doing math in my head. No, that was when I started on KNUS as a guest host, was when I was actually not quite 21. So anyway, I appreciate it. Thank you for the sentiments. And it's always great to get your perspective. You bring a keen analytical insight into, particularly on communication. And I've just been so struck by how the Biden team is talking about the economy. I want to play a clip. I played it a couple times in the last hour, but it's from CNBC. I'm not sure who the Biden official was, but they're talking about gas prices. Take a listen.
Is there a sense that if gasoline really were to start to pressure the consumer going into an election year, that the administration would look to make further moves on the SPR or anything else?
Well, it's certainly the case that gas prices, especially on this Labor Day weekend, matter a lot for American households. We all know that it matters in terms of how much money they have left at the end of the month. And so we keep a very close eye on that. As you know, the president took very strong actions when prices at the pump spiked earlier. They've come down very substantially, but we're going to keep our eyes on those gas prices because they do matter so much for American families.
Let's just go to that clip. Oh, they matter. They matter. They matter. We're keeping an eye on those gas prices. How do you view that as a communications professional?
Well, first of all, that is such a great example of evading the question. right? It was sort of a lot of doublespeak, and I always say you can get a lot from what someone's saying and what they truly mean by the subtext. So if you recall in that clip of her response, there were some ums and ahs in there. When you really have an answer, there doesn't need to be any kind of verbal tick. You don't need to be struggling to find the words. You can actually respond to the question that was asked of you. So I would give that response, regardless of the topic, but just how she responded, a pretty big F, because it does not get at what that questioner was asking. It is very interesting to me that this current administration, and I'm pretty nonpartisan, right down the middle, but they have not really wanted to have substantive conversations about the economy. So many people are struggling, Jimmy. Interest rates are crazy. I mean, the housing market has slowed because people are staying in their homes. They don't want to risk having an 8, 9, 10% interest rate if they go buy a new home. So it would be very courageous if the Biden administration and Biden himself would talk about those real numbers facing the American people. That's really what I've been waiting for.
Here is Jared Bernstein, quick clip. He did a couple of things this week over, I think it was on CNN. One of them was he brushed off the fact that we have now $1 trillion plus in credit card debt and said, oh, well, everybody is able to service the debt, which is like, oh, they can make their payments, so don't worry about it. He also said the following.
Look, the Fed's going to do what it's going to do. From our perspective, we want houses to have we want households to have some breathing room. We want their real wages to keep going up.
Real wages to keep going up. Real wages are actually down overall under the Biden administration. Then you have the president himself.
Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal have heard me say it before, started calling my plan Bidenomics. It's about investing in America and investing in Americans. It's working.
Why, Roshini Rajkumar, do you think the Biden administration insists on trying to put lipstick on this pig and constantly saying, oh, it's working, real wages are up, this and that, while the American people, as polls show, aren't too keen on the economy because it's not doing so well and they're not buying what Biden is selling?
Yeah, I don't understand why. And again, I go back to the subtextual messages. If you really had economic wins, you don't need to respond to questions or even hold press conferences and give us kind of jingoism. You actually would have results. You could tell us, well, this percentage of Americans are doing this much better, or this percentage of people who had student loan debt have actually paid it off, or this or that or the other thing. That's a specific example of a group of people who have been helped. We don't really hear those kinds of answers, at least if they're out there. I have missed them. And that tells us that no matter who it is, Democrat or Republican, whatever question is asked, they are evading because the answer isn't that great. I would love it if our leaders could just look us in the eye and tell us exactly what's going on and tell us how they're going to fix it. Or if it's a good thing, tell us how they're going to continue the good thing. That's what I keep waiting for from all of these leaders, and definitely from President Biden.
Just real quick, Karine Jean-Pierre, White House press secretary.
I love how you say her name.
A quick little clip.
The president has done more to secure the border and to deal with this issue of immigration than anybody else. He really has.
I don't have a clip of the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, saying things contra to this. But even on the border, you have the White House press secretary literally trying to get people to believe, oh, well, Biden's the strongest on the border. Meanwhile, Democrats across the country have been sounding the alarm over the past year or so, saying this is out of control.
Those kinds of answers just make us think the president and those advising him are really out of touch, or they're just flat out lying to us. Because I don't know that any Americans say we've got things under control on the border. Immigration is such an issue, and regardless of whether you believe in the wall or not, or what the policy is or not, I don't think any president, current or really in the recent past, can take much credit for what's happening with immigration. It is such, it is really an epidemic problem, like that level of a problem. And I don't know when we're going to have any fixes. So it doesn't do Biden or his press secretary any good to be saying things like that just are so confusing. You're just like, are we living in the same country?
I can't resist. One more clip of Karine Jean-Pierre with Steve Ducey talking about Maui and how Hawaii's crisis was handled with the fire and hurricanes and comparing those responses.
It seems like the hurricane response so far is robust. Did you guys realize that the initial Hawaii wildfire response was not that good? Or is it just easier for people to get help from the White House when the president is not on vacation?
So the premise of your question and the way you posed your question, I disagree, just for the record. So if you were to do your reporting and speak to the governor of Hawaii, the senators of Hawaii, the folks on the ground, they would say that the president reacted in record time when it came to dealing with the wildfires, when it came to dealing and making sure that they got everything that they need on the federal level to deal with what was going on the ground. Let's not forget there were more than 600 federal employees on the ground already to assist with the wildfires in Maui. So your question is wrong. It's flawed in many, many ways. And I would advise you to go speak to the governor and the local and state officials in Hawaii.
Oh, there are so many local folks, Roshini Rajkumar, who were saying, oh, they're giving us $600. They're doing this. They're not really doing anything. The perception that people on the ground, actual citizens were having does not line up with anything KJP said. Again.
Aloof. I don't even, it just smacks the actual reality of what happened and what is happening on the ground. The president was absolutely criticized for not being very responsive in a timely fashion. And even, as we know, we're finding out more now, local authorities bungled things very much to even contribute to the cause of what happened in Maui. So I get very frustrated with this doublespeak that any administration, I don't care who's in the White House, when their press secretaries sit there and try to feed us a bunch of garbage. It's just very condescending.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not going to play well as this election cycle continues.
Economy, border, biggest fire in the history of Hawaii, no matter what it is. Doublespeak is the name of the game. Again, we're talking with Roshini Rajkumar, host of the Crisis Files podcast, which is on its 58th episode with the title, The Trump Card. Let's look at the presidential race for a moment. What do you make of this, especially in light of the indictments of Trump? Most recently, the one in Georgia. He's got, 4 indictments now, I think. Could be 1 or 2 more on the way. And yet, he is well atop the polls.
Yeah, he's the front runner. I mean, that should tell all of us as a country, as a nation, as voters, that nobody has this down, and definitely the Republicans don't have it down, if Trump is the front runner. And over here on the Democratic side, and I say this in case file 58, the Trump card, I'm disappointed in Biden himself. I think it's an incredible lack of leadership that he continues to believe he should be the Democrats' 2024 candidate. What he should do is be one of the elders in the party and say, okay, what's our succession plan? Who else is out there? Who can I help groom? Who can I put my name behind that should really become the contender on the Democratic side? So there's such a lack of leadership on both sides. I'm going to criticize both parties here.
Yeah.
Now, as far as these indictments, Jimmy, we've talked about them on your show. I've talked about them on other airwaves. We got into it in case file number 58. And the thing is, as a lawyer, I'm a licensed attorney. It is not a good idea to use criminal charges against your opponents. And I'm not going to play the party line that the Republicans are saying, but just speaking as a lawyer, when you bring charges against anyone, let alone, this very unprecedented situation, the former president of the United States, you better be able to prove those out with legitimate, real evidence in a court of law, not conjecture, not politics, not innuendo. And that's what is a real problem with some of the indictments among the 4. And then there's a whole issue of, do we really want to go down the line where we convict, if it comes to that, a former president of the United States? And nobody should be above the law, but that actually goes for the prosecutors that are pulling these charges together or are calling grand juries and all of that. So it is an interesting time. The other candidates on the Republican side should also be looking at what are they doing wrong that the former president, who has 4 indictments going, is beating them in the polls. And I'm not a huge fan of the polls, but still, that's what everyone talks about. Beating them by a big margin in the polls. What does that say about those other Republican contenders?
But what you see, and this has been fascinating. I actually asked Larry Elder about this. He didn't make the debate stage, but he's running for president. He was on the show a couple weeks ago, just before the debate. And I asked him about defending Trump on the legal issues from a candidacy standpoint, because most of the candidates will defend Trump on the indictments. So as he's rising amidst the indictments, they're not going after him at all for it. Instead, they're trying to play into the base and say, well, I think that the indictments are wrong. Vote for me otherwise. And it's like, well, if you're defending your primary opponent on the biggest weakness in a general election, what does that say about your ability to win in a primary if you're not even critical of that?
Yeah, there has to be some other kind of response to that. You're absolutely correct. But what I also think the subtextual message of that is if all of these or several of these candidates would support him if he gets the nomination in spite of the indictments, they're also saying these indictments are not based on much, have a thin base. So it's an interesting situation. Jimmy, you and I have talked politics over, the 9 years I've been coming on your show. This is beyond crazy this time that we're in. I mean, we have talked about some very interesting layers in American politics, but I just don't even know. And, there are a lot of people in this country who are Trump supporters. And I am not a fan of Trump just getting reelected. I'll be very honest about that. But I'm also not a fan of Biden getting reelected. Well, I really wish both parties would stir things up and dig deep and really ask themselves what they're doing.
Going along with Roshini Rajkumar this morning, this is so interesting. I want to go back August of 2014 in our conversation then, when it was the first time you were on the show, and we ended up doing 3 segments, by the way, when we were only going to do one, lo and behold. But we talked about the different candidates that were being considered as possible folks for the Republican nomination in 2016. And that included Chris Christie, who is running again this time. I want to play a clip here that I think has some resonance from back then with today.
Christie. I'd be curious to know what your take is on the whole Christie thing, Jimmy.
In which respect?
Do you think he even has a chance? Do you think he's even thinking about it?
In the Republican primary, I really don't think that Chris Christie at this point has much of a chance to get through the primary. I think in a general election,
he has a chance.
I think he probably does, because I think he's able to coalesce the support of certain governors and others around the country. And that's a very interesting question, though, as to whether or not he thinks he does to the point where he will actually run for that position. Right. And I tend to think that he probably will run, but it'll be the next several months that will particularly emphasize to him whether or not he's got that pathway forward.
And that's why I brought up my line about the color of truth. It is always appealing. But when you have some people going into this stage of the cycle with serious controversies like Bridgegate, Hillary on the other side is dealing with some of her own things, even though I know she hasn't officially announced. And then Rick Perry with this indictment. What really, at this point, I think you got to worry more about the truth of matters before you can even get to how am I going to look, right? Because that's really where the game is right now. If you're really going for the long game and want to be in this, in more than
can you stick around another few minutes on the other side?
Yeah.
All right. We'll be right back with Roshini. We got to go to a quick break.
So that was 2014. But it has a lot of resonance today. We even had a candidate who was indicted, in Rick Perry, and he did a photo and he was laughing about it and whatnot, which I totally forgot about. And obviously now Chris Christie doesn't believe. He can't believe that he actually has a shot at the Republican nomination. He's running so that he can get digs in at Trump that other candidates won't. How would you take what we discussed in that clip and apply it to today?
It is amazing the change in 9 years. I mean, back then it was shocking, that indictment. And now you are reminding me of it by playing that clip against Rick Perry. And we're talking about things that back then absolutely would hurt candidates. And now look where we are. It's almost like nothing would surprise us that a candidate was doing or has done. Almost nothing can hurt their popularity if they truly are popular and have supporters. That, I think, is an interesting expression of the whole process here, our American democratic system. And it might actually be a sorry state of affairs that we as the voters, either we're just not lucky, we're not getting great candidates, or we don't have higher standards and don't demand more. So that's an interesting state. And I'm glad you played that clip because it's a great reminder of just 9 years ago, things that might have shocked us and prevented someone from getting elected or even being on a debate stage. Now almost anything goes.
Real quick, because we got to run, Roshini, before I let you go, what would you advise in terms of how these opponents to Trump should communicate about the indictment, knowing how, and this includes a lot of folks who are listening right now, knowing that they're still supportive of him or that he's even gaining ground because they think that there's some sort of a political vendetta going on here?
Well, it is a very tricky line to walk, but they have to say something a bit disparaging. But what they really have to do more is highlight their strengths. I mean, they really do. And none of them have really done that. I mean, Vivek does it, but I don't know that I always believe Vivek. He says kind of the right thing, but I question some of his actual fundamental game plan for the country. But they really need to find, in an authentic way, their own voice. And they can say, look, I have a great record. I've never been charged with a crime. They can come up with their own way to disparage, but that isn't a direct attack on Trump. Because if you're going to build your whole campaign on attacking Trump, it's not going to work.
Well, and that's not going to work out for Chris Christie then, because that's what his whole campaign is based on, although we knew that going in. Roshini Rajkumar, check out the Crisis Files podcast, most recent episode 58, the Trump card on all the podcast platforms. Really appreciate your time and your friendship and guestship. Is that a word? I don't know. But over the past so many years, really appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy, and congrats on 10.
Thank you, my friend. Once again, Roshini Rajkumar, host of The Crisis Files, joining us on the Jimmy Sangenberger Show.